Hello and welcome to Livewire's Buy, Hold, Sell. I'm Selby and today we're taking a deep dive into the US election and what that could mean for markets. With betting markets swinging each way every single week, it's anyone's guess who could win. So to help you prepare, we're joined by Jacob Mitchell from Antipodes and Arvid Streimann from Magellan. Jacob, I'm going to start with you today. How important is the macro to your process?
Yeah, sure, Ali. It's great to be here. Look, we think about our macro as being integrated right across the process. It's a toolkit that we can use in a holistic way. So that means our sector teams that are picking stocks from the bottom up, they're using quant factors to screen the universe. We're also thinking about from portfolio construction, after we've put, as we're building that portfolio, what tilts are we building into it? Do we think we're being compensated for, sort of risks in certain areas, whether they're factor risk, region risk, sector? And then finally, it's really also just determining where tail risks are emerging. And if the left tail or the right tail is starting to fatten out, how do we protect the portfolio on the left, and then on the right, how do we potentially capture more alpha?
Is it similar at Magellan? Do you focus on the top down as well, or is it more bottom up?
Yeah, look, I think it's fairly similar. We look at both top down and bottom up. They're both part of our investment process. But when we're thinking about macro, we actually have two ways that we think about analysing macro risk. The first is we're looking for event risk, and that could be something like maybe what's the risk that there's going to be some attacks on some Middle Eastern energy oil infrastructure and sends oil prices sky high and maybe creates a recession. That would be something like an event risk that we look at from a macro perspective. The second type of risk that we're thinking about in macro is trend identification, and there I think a very obvious one to talk about is the ageing population. So we think about these macro risks. It's a core part of what we're doing with our investment philosophy. But I always tell people we're not a macro hedge fund here, we're investing in stocks, and that's why the bottom up is really important as well.
Why do we rely on betting markets for US election predictions?
Yeah, look, from my perspective, I think that we're always trying to figure out what's the likelihood of each candidate winning, and you can't measure it explicitly. So let's look at betting markets. You can also look at professional forecasters. And when we're thinking about how accurate those betting markets can be, I think that you just have to look back to the 2016 election where one of the big betting houses actually paid out on Hillary Clinton, who didn't win. They paid out on her early, and then they had to go and pay out people who'd bet on Donald Trump. So I think you look at it and you go, okay, it's interesting, it's a source of information, but I wouldn't say that it's something that you would bet your house on and take with, you have to take with a grain of salt.
Jacob, do you feel like there's any problem with us relying so heavily on betting markets?
Yeah, definitely. I think a betting market is no different to, looking at polls, as Arvid said, or focus groups, or, they really are also impacted by sentiment. And so they can get it wrong, and just as the polls can get it wrong. And I think what matters more is, just understanding probably the economy, in terms of what the outcome of the election, or it's probably more related to what's going on in the economy and the degree of social cohesion. And obviously that's in pretty short supply at the moment in the US.
100%. How have elections impacted the economy in the past? Is there any data that supports, one party winning or the other, and how that impacts markets and the economy?
Yeah, look, it's really interesting, Ali. It's the data over a long period of time in the US anyway, is that in the year following the election, returns are noticeably lower than a normal year, and also the chances of a recession happening are much higher, and that's it's obviously linked also to whether the incumbent wins, so be wary. If there's a change of government, the chances of the recession happening are also higher.
Okay, what data have you seen about the impact of elections on markets?
Yeah, look, if you go back to the 2016 election where Donald Trump won, one of the big things that he did was implement this Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which had a lot of corporate tax cuts in it. And so the US corporate tax rate went from 35% down to 21%. And that tax cut in and of itself increased post-tax profits by about 22%, so just over 20%. And all else equal, that increased valuations by about 20% as well. So I say that what the new government does is very important as well. So this goes to the policies that they introduce. And if you go back to the Biden administration, they introduced the Inflation Reduction Act, and they threw about $400 billion at clean energy as well. So maybe it doesn't have such a big impact on the overall market as much as the corporate tax increase. But if you're sitting there and you're receiving a lot of this cash, then your business is actually doing quite well.
I want you to take out your crystal ball, look into the future. What would a Trump second term mean for the macro forces in markets?
Yeah, look, I think that a Trump administration, if he was to win, would be actually quite positive for markets. But it depends, how positive it is, depends on whether the Republican Party of which he's a part actually wins control of the Congress. So that's the House of Representatives and the Senate. Because if that party does get full control of government, then they can do a lot more in terms of legislative change, introducing new laws. And so I think that a Trump administration would be pro-growth. Okay, so it would be good for earnings in an overall setting. But that would push up inflation, which will also push up interest rates a little bit. And we know that he's going to have some stern conversations with China as well. But I think that he is going to be erratic. But when he first became president, people didn't quite know how erratic he was going to be. And so it was a bit of a surprise. Now I think we're all expecting it. So if he's erratic, maybe it's less of an impact on markets. But overall, I think that he'd be relatively good for markets.
Do you have any other predictions if Trump does win again?
Look, we would say markets generally like continuity. And, the Democrats have introduced a lot of, let's call it pro-investment legislation. Biden was quite proactive. Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act are two examples. And, the range of outcomes or uncertainty under a Trump or a transition, if you like, to a new regime, I think would go up. And in the medium term, I think that would be negative for growth. I think in the short term, I'd agree with Arvid. The sugar rush response from the market will be a rerun of tax cuts. The only problem with that is now we're starting point deficit is larger. The starting point government debt to GDP is larger. And the underlying inflation rate, and I would argue the sensitivity of the economy to inflation is higher.
Yeah.
So I think you'd give it back pretty quickly with a higher 10-year yield, and then there would be question marks around, just the fiscal sustainability, and that wouldn't be good for markets. And then on top of that, I think China has also seen Trump Mark 1, so they're in a much, I think, stronger position, having preserved their government position and not overstimulated during COVID. They have a lot of fiscal flexibility that the US doesn't have. And so I think they see it coming. They're starting to stimulate. They've been quite modest, but they can certainly ramp that up in the face of tariffs.
Okay. What kind of stocks would benefit if Trump does win?
Do
you have any examples as well?
Yeah, look, I think just domestic, not so much the multinationals, but, financials in the US, companies that are earning most of their profits to the extent they get a tax cut. You can make a case that the US could start to broaden out a little bit in terms of the winners, although I don't think it's the end of the mega cap quality trade, because I think there could be just those stocks could be seen as defensives in an environment where regulatory uncertainty actually starts to widen, and economic uncertainty actually starts to widen in the US under Trump.
What kind of stocks would you be backing if Trump does win?
Well, I think that he's shown a couple of things. The first is that he's very pro energy supply, so increasing the supply of fossil fuels into the American economy. And so I think that big oil as a sector would do quite well with him, because I think that he would actually reduce the restrictions and loosen the permitting, engage in permitting reform, which would allow them to pump more oil, essentially. So I think that those types of companies would do quite well. Another area which I think would do quite well is that the companies which are exposed to the decoupling or the onshoring or reshoring trend, which I think would accelerate under Donald Trump. And so if we're thinking about what might happen there, if stuff has to be built in America, then I think that maybe factories have to be built. So companies like Caterpillar that build heavy equipment which can build these types of factories and supporting infrastructure, I think maybe they could do quite well if there is a re-acceleration or an acceleration in the onshoring trend.
Okay, moving on to Kamala with the Democrats now. What would that mean for the macro forces in markets?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question because Kamala Harris is behind in the polls, or at least in the betting, and I think it really depends on whether the Democratic Party gets a clean sweep, or what I would call control of the White House, control of the House of Representatives, and control of the Senate. Because if that's enabled, then I think that she'll be able to introduce more legislative change, and we all know that she's probably more progressive than Donald Trump. I think it's quite safe to say that. And what that means is that she would engage, or try to engage in, let's call it wealth transfer or funds transfer from, let's call it rich people or companies towards lower income consumers. So I think that what you would see there, if there was a clean sweep or a trifecta, is something that's relatively unfriendly to the corporate sector in general. Okay, I'm talking about in general. And one of the things that she's talked about is raising the corporate tax rate, which I think would slice about 10% off corporate taxes and valuations, all else equal. So I think it would be quite a challenging thing. I think it's lowly priced by markets. I'd say that market valuations are quite elevated at the moment. So that risk, which is kind of small, if it was to happen, I think it would be a negative shock for markets. But if the Democratic Party did not get the clean sweep, then she's obviously more constrained. So the impact would be far more muted.
Do you feel the same?
No, I mean, we would sort of say that Kamala is about continuity. Giving American companies under the various acts and investment plans that have been put in place certainty to go and invest. And look, where Trump could give a tax cut, and Kamala's more likely to raise taxes. That's roughly right. But when you look at the fiscal position, the markets may actually say, well, that's actually rational. And I think should be much more, let's call it constructive on the pathway, should be less inflationary than Trump. The chances of a clean sweep for the Democrats is almost non-existent. So I think there's a much higher chance of a clean sweep on the Republican side. And I think that would really widen the range of outcomes in a potentially negative way for the longer term pathway of inflation in the US and fiscal sustainability. But let's make it clear, I mean, both parties in the US are fiscal activists. There's no fiscal conservative party left in the US, and which is why gold and other sort of inflation protected assets are performing so well.
What kind of stocks would benefit from a Kamala presidency? I'm guessing it would be, those sustainable kind of stocks.
Look, that's what I think that would be the sort of the go-to. But look, quite frankly, I think it's probably parts of the market. Probably the chances of, I think, just the getting dovish rate cuts are probably higher, and so the softer landing beneficiaries. You can see parts of the financials, definitely the green energy trade, to the extent that it's not overhyped. But I would say you'd be leaning towards stocks that are going to be doing in a lower rate environment.
Okay, over to you, Arvid. Which stocks would you be backing in a Kamala presidency?
Yeah, look, I think she's shown, as you pointed out, a clear preference for companies that are involved in the green transition or supporting the green transition. So I think that's a fertile place to look. I also think, consistent with what I said earlier, I think that she's engaging in, or she would like to engage in, let's call it wealth redistribution. I think that she's quite progressive on this. So I think that it's a bit like a Robin Hood strategy, maybe take from the rich and give to the poor. And so I think maybe those companies that are more exposed to the lower income consumers, and we certainly have some retailers that sort of cater to that cohort of households, maybe Dollar Generals, might do a little bit better in some relative sense, and maybe also in some absolute sense. I think that these are the types of things that are quite important to her.
Okay, a little bit of a challenge here. I'm going to ask you to guess who will win the election in November. Who are you going to back?
Oh, look, I think Donald Trump is going to win here, and we've been saying this internally for quite a while. We put about a 55% probability on that, And when Joe Biden was still running as the Democrat candidate, we had Donald Trump higher, about 70%. And the reason really is I actually think that incumbents are at a bit of a disadvantage in elections at the moment, and particularly given what we've seen with inflation, because what inflation's done is really reduce households and people's purchasing power, which really goes to their standard of living. And so I think people are quite upset about that, and even though the inflation rates come back down, the price levels are still quite high. It's not like the inflation rate's gone negative and then the price levels recovered back to where they are. So I think that people's standard of livings have suffered, and I think you can see this in consumer sentiment. You can also see this in the way that a lot of incumbent governments have recently, during this inflation period, have really been finding it quite tough to get re-elected. So I think this is one of the main reasons, or one of the main things that Donald Trump has in his back pocket, so to speak. It's one of the tailwinds he has. When we think about Kamala Harris, she's obviously playing a small target strategy. I think she's waiting for Donald Trump to sort of blow himself up and then she'll sort of sweep in a bit like Stephen Bradbury. But I think that what she's actually doing, or not doing, I should say, is giving people hope. And I think that when you look back to what Obama did with his yes, we can type messaging, I think that gave people a lot of hope about what could happen in a very positive sense if he was to be elected as president. And I'm not sure that Kamala Harris has done that. So I think that Trump's ahead at the moment.
Okay, over to you, Jacob. Who do you think will win the US election?
Trump, yeah. I think Arvid summarised it pretty well. So, yeah, I think I think the chances of a clean sweep are fairly high. Yeah, it's all that. It's the inflation. It's the I think it's not winning in certain key demographics. The Democrat message is just not cutting through. And there's a lot of anxiousness. The US system, because of the college votes system, it is, you have to win in individual states, and quite frankly, the US system is quite polarized. You could almost say gerrymandered. And so you have deep blue states, deep red states, and then there's a few that matter in terms of the final outcome. And in those states, they tend to be traditionally Democrat states that are slowly becoming more Republican. And, the key controversy or the key issue is, the rate of immigration, whether it's legal or illegal, is, I think, in those battleground issues, the Democrats are just losing on that issue.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of Buy, Hold, Sell as much as I did. If you did, why not give it a like? Remember to subscribe to our YouTube and podcast channels. We're adding so much great content just like this every single week.